Welcome to The Academic Issue, your go-to podcast on Canadian academia. We are University Affairs, Canada's premier publication dedicated to higher education. For over 60 years, we've been at the heart of the nation's university community, providing news, commentary, and advice to those working in the hallowed halls across the country. Whether you're a seasoned professor, a curious grad student, or just intrigued by the inner workings of university life, we've got you covered. I'm Kate Kenyon, digital content creator for University Affairs, and I'm looking at the forces shaping higher education today and what they mean for you. So join me as I explore life through the academic lens. This is The Academic Issue. What happens when an entire profession changes, but no one rewrites the rulebook? For generations, a PhD was a stepping stone to a stable academic career. Today, it's more like a leap of faith. These days, many highly qualified scholars find themselves trapped in a cycle of precarious, short-term contracts, cobbling together multiple teaching gigs with little stability, low pay, and tenure endlessly out of reach. It's a system that runs on what some call hope labor, the idea that working for less now will eventually lead to something better. But does it? In this episode, we're unpacking the realities of sessional work in Canada's universities. What forces have led to this entrenched reliance on precarious academic labor? What toll does it take on those who do the work? And is there a way out of the cycle? This conversation was sparked by an article published in University Affairs titled The Exploitation Trap of Hope Labor, written by Jamie Paris, an instructor at the University of Manitoba. In it, he lays out how universities justify these labor practices and why they persist. I wanted to hear more from Jamie about the reality of sessional academics and how we got here. So welcome, Jamie, to The Academic Issue. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. We invited you on today to discuss the article that you've written recently for University Affairs entitled The Exploitation Trap of Hope Labor, which tackles a subject that is, I think, quite well known within the university community, but perhaps less so among the general public. And that subject is the reliance of Canadian universities on so-called precarious faculty. Now, there are lots of different terms we could use to describe these faculty members. I've heard precarious faculty, contingent faculty, sessional lecturers. Can we start by you defining for us who exactly you are talking about in your piece?
So the term I like to use is adjunct, which is literally, to be a part of, but not necessarily essential to. And this is a good way to think about this kind of labor. We're talking about people who often do not have permanent contracts. So they might know what they're working for one term, but they don't know what they're working for the next. They might know what they're working for 1 year or 2 years, but there's a clear end date.
And these people are often teaching classes at more than one institution in order to make a salary. So they're sometimes working across different universities, right?
So if you don't get enough credits at one school, say you only get 1 or 2 classes, now you're driving around to different schools and you're teaching 5, 6. I heard one person teaching 7 of these, sometimes online classes. You have very little control over how many students you're teaching. I have a good friend who's teaching a section of 150 first-year students. And you might think about, what does that do in terms of your ability to sit down and have office hours, to mentor, to do the basic work? So much of teaching work is outside the classroom. The lectures are the least important part of my job, right? The marking matters, the mentoring matters.
Yeah, we're talking here about people who are on a temporary contract that is renewed possibly every term, not even every year. And these are people who, in some cases, have been on these rolling contracts for 7, 10, I've even heard 14 years in a row. And even after all that time spent working as an adjunct faculty member, they don't become permanent. They don't ever become a permanent member of the faculty staff, right?
One of the misconceptions I think the general public has is we tend to think of these like paying your dues. You're a carpenter, you apprentice for a couple years, then you get your ticket and you get a full-time job. This doesn't work that way at all in our system, unfortunately. Well, there are individuals, I'm one of them, who sessional for a minute and then transition to permanent jobs. What we're really talking about are people who kind of get wrapped in these positions because there's no actual economic incentive for the university to change things. And frankly, the universities just aren't hiring, not at substantial rates, not at the rates that are sort of requisite for the number of students we're actually teaching. So without these impermanent positions, often positions with little to no benefits, positions with really minimal job stability, you're going to get a situation where the university couldn't function without this cheap labor. It's kind of the Uberification of the university system.
And often research is not funded by the university for this kind of contract, right? So really what they're being paid for is teaching. So if they want to conduct research, that's often very difficult for them to finance.
And yet, if you want to get from these temporary, often no benefit positions into a position with benefits, you need that research. So even for me, where I'm in a teaching primary position, so I'm evaluated and promoted primarily based on my teaching work, the fact is I don't get that position without writing several academic articles, putting together a book, all this kind of stuff. So the university gets this wonderful bonus of having a bunch of people all trying to stand out by doing all of this service work, and yet no one has to compensate for any of it.
You mentioned in your article that it's difficult to find statistics on contingent faculty in Canada. You did make reference to trends in the US where there is existing data. Are you able to give any sense of how widespread this situation is in Canada?
So the best numbers I've seen are from CUAT, and we're talking about over 50% of classes now are being taught by contingent faculties. Again, this gets really difficult when we start talking about who are the contingent, because sometimes the reason why these numbers aren't very valid is university self-report. So who do they put in the category? Do they include a postdoc in that category? Do they include a 2-year lecturer? Do they include someone who's maybe on a 3-year appointment, right? I've heard some numbers that suggest that the reality is it might be up to 75% of actual classroom teaching hours in Canada right now are being done by faculty who do not have full job permanence. The public tends to think that we all have tenure, that we all sort of, have unlimited free time. And the reality is the group of people who have tenure, we're talking about 25 to 30% of the actual university faculty. And then there's another group who, like me, have job permanence. And that's a small group. And interestingly, that group is dramatically overrepresented with minorities, with women, people of color sort of thing. And then you get the adjunct sort of underclass that holds the whole system together.
You really paint a picture in your article of universities being dependent, reliant on this, as you call it, underclass. Can you speak more a bit about that? What are these people offering the universities and why couldn't the universities do without them?
And what we're seeing in terms of what the university depends on is it's those first and second year courses, the big survey courses. That's really, the tenure profs don't always want to do them. They're not as much fun. This is where you're going to deal with plagiarism cases. This is where you're going to see, in my field anyway, we bring in students from all over the world, which means people are learning to write in very different ways in different countries. Even within Canada, there's huge variations, sometimes within a city, huge variations in terms of students' university preparedness. Your first and second year teachers are the ones who even that out and give everyone a fighting chance to get their degree. That work is incredibly important. It is the work that makes the degree possible. And yet, it's not necessarily the work the tenured profs want to do or want to do as much of.
Are these also the largest classes, typically, with the highest number of students?
Typically they are, right? So you've got this really neat scenario where the university has its lowest paid members working in classrooms with the highest profit margin, right? Because obviously the more students I can get into a class and get through a credit, the higher the profit margin is for that particular class. And when I talk to students, they don't know. They have no idea because there's a shame, a stigma attached to it. So sessional laborers don't talk about themselves as sessionals. If you were just a student walking into a room and you saw two people with a PhD teaching your intro anthropology class, how would you know?
Reading your article and researching for this podcast episode, I thought back to my own degree. I was definitely taught by these people and I had not a clue. It never even crossed my mind. I assumed that everyone in the faculty had the same kind of deal. I do think that's a major factor here. Not just the students within the university, but I think the broader public don't know much about this. If you ask someone, random person on the street, an example of precarious employment, they're not going to think of a university lecturer. Why do you think this is so unknown? Is it just the shame, the stigmatization around it?
That's a really good question. That's been the question that's been sort of gnawing at me a little bit. Asking that question also helps us explain why some of these incredibly highly skilled, highly marketable people are staying in these low to no paying jobs. I think some of it is the cultural prestige of being a professor, being able to tell people that you teach at the university. It's exciting. It's exciting to teach a class and have students, you're teaching Hamlet, you're explaining a complex soliloquy, students are hanging on what you say. There's power involved in grading students. You feel like you're determining a little bit like what the next generation will do. These things are attractive. I think then the difficulty is when the public looks at us, they see people who are doing what we want. We have an incredible degree of power, and they just assume that good pay must go with it. Because why would we stay? Why would someone stay if they're a PhD and not go into industry or some other thing?
We think that pay goes with prestige, right?
We do. And it doesn't. And it hasn't for a long time. We're not great advocates for ourselves as university professors. We sometimes struggle talking to the general public. We sometimes struggle figuring out how to communicate about these issues. And once you're out of the sessional pool, they become invisible to you. So this article was written for me, actually, because I realized I didn't know the names of the sessionals in my department. I don't think I'm a particularly amoral person who just ignores labor. It was really just a matter of, because people are everywhere, driving all over the city, they weren't in the office. I wasn't talking to them. But a lot goes downhill from that, right? If I don't know your name, I can't mentor you. I can't help you sort of land your next job. And as you become invisible to me, that's kind of a nice metaphor for you becoming invisible to students, administrators, other groups of people.
You mentioned in your article a bifurcated caste system where contingent faculty often are teaching the large introductory courses, while it's the tenured faculty teaching the smaller specialized classes. And, you're really speaking to a division there where you're not even able to form a professional relationship with these people because they are transient. How does this division between those two groups impact the experiences of both contingent faculty and the students that they teach, do you think?
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. One of the things I didn't realize before I got into the university sector is I just assumed we watched each other teach. We don't. So what this means is student evaluations of teaching take on a disproportionate importance when we're talking about promotion, job retention, things of this nature. So if you're teaching a group of 150 first years, often their evaluations are going to be based on things like, are you entertaining? Can you tell a joke? Can you clearly explain the material? These are good things, but sometimes it's also, we find racist and sexist evaluations, sometimes in overt, sometimes in less overt ways. We find some students maybe don't do as well as they want to in terms of their grade. Maybe they have a plagiarism case. That tends to come out in evaluations. They can be a little bit like Yelp reviews. So what ends up happening if we don't know our sessional faculty and we don't develop those relationships, we also don't develop counter narratives. So then all you know is a rate my professor score. I love that it's called rate my professor, and yet the vast majority of people who are on it are not professors.
That's so awful.
And those scores start to determine who gets jobs. They start to determine your professional reputation.
Do they really? They have that power?
They really do. And as someone who, does fairly well on those scores, I do well because I develop relationships with students. And that's the real issue. It's developing relationships, right? If you don't have the time and wherewithal, if you're stressed and tired, you're not developing those relationships. And this is the thing I think I didn't understand about the system as well, is there's always somebody else. You would think there'd be very few people who can teach these classes, but we're overproducing PhDs based on the market trends. A PhD is a beautiful thing to do. We should keep producing PhDs. But when you start producing my PhD program, we graduated 10 PhDs in my field. And I think 3 of us landed permanent jobs within the first 5 years. You know, many have gone on to do wonderful things, but that's UBC, right? That's like the number 2 school in Canada. Then you start asking, well, what are U of M PhDs doing? And you realize really quickly, we're creating a labor class that is so dependent on these jobs. And it's scary to leave the university system because it's hard to explain our specializations to other people. It's hard to explain our skill sets to new fields. And sometimes it just feels like an investment fallacy. You've put so much time into becoming the professor, and giving that up can feel like a real loss. It feels almost like getting divorced.
You talk about hope labor, this idea of clinging on term after term, year after year, in the hope that it will all pay off eventually. Can you speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, so I mean, hope labor is a really neat idea, right? It comes from Kathleen Kern and Thomas F. Corrigan. And the idea of hope labor is capitalism needs asymmetrical power relationships to maintain itself. That's sort of the game. And we often enter into labor in capitalist systems and hope that at some point we will be on sort of the asymmetrical side of the ledger, that we will get into the boss's chair, that we will get into management, that we will develop some level of stability and security. Hope labor is the labor you do that is uncompensated or undercompensated in hopes that it will be recognized, in hopes that it will be appreciated. It's the putting together the department Christmas party, not because someone offered you money, but because you hope that that's going to put you in good stead with the bosses. It's setting up the summer retreat. It's the runaround work that we do because we believe. I also see this with people who drive Ubers. You know, a lot of times there's this belief that it could work out, that you could make a lot of money. And maybe you could. Maybe you had a really good week. But hope labor maintains itself when I start paying you in possibility.
Yeah.
So that possibility becomes a currency other than, you know, actual money.
It could all end up leading to nothing very easily, right? All of the investment, all of the extra, all of the above and beyond that these people have committed to the university could all lead, not to be too dreary about it, but it could lead to nothing and there would be no consequences for the institution, right?
Exactly. None at all for the institution. And not only could it, it does. It does all the time. And we don't tell those stories because every one of those stories feels like, oh, but this person should have done this. Oh, this person should have done that. It's always on the person, right? And if you work in a job where you're undercompensated and you do that for 20 years, you're going to have rougher edges. This is a reality of life. And it's easy to blame individuals for these rougher edges, to say, well, that's why you don't have permanence. One thing I like to think about when we're sort of talking about this question of what hope labor does is what happens when you lose hope. Right. So if you've been working from a perspective of I hope, I want, I desire, you've got this picture in your mind of the future, whatever it is, that picture gets clearer and clearer, almost the farther you are away from it. And then when you realize you're never going to get it, well, now you realize yourself, your very concept of who you are, got tied up in that narrative about your future. Walking away from hope labor is walking away from yourself. It's walking away from a concept of who you want to be. That's a really hard thing to ask a person to do. And universities know this. When KFC does it, I'm like, okay, you're a corporation. Your job is to maximize profits. I see you. When a university that says it's about the public good, that says everyone here deserves dignity and grace, does this, I'm like, pump the brakes. Let's at least talk about this openly. Let's start making sure at minimum that parents understand your kid's tuition is artificially low because we're doing something like this.
Are there any advantages to this system? Have you ever met people who enjoy this kind of professional existence?
Yes, I absolutely have. One of the groups I've met who really enjoy it are artists, sometimes being asked to teach a course, maybe like a creative fiction course, when you've got a stable career, can be really prestigious and can feel great. I know people who teach in business, who have their own businesses and they have a specialized skill and they're excited to tell people about what they do and to network with young students who might become their employees one day.
This is a nice add-on to a career that's already stable, right?
Yeah. So like when I see people who have stable careers, often this is wonderful. Back in the days, a lot of these positions were created for the spouses of faculty. So if I had a stable full-time job in a city and I wanted to bring my partner to that city, them being able to teach a couple sessional classes, let them be part of the culture of the departments. That kind of single income life in the university, it's not realistic anymore. Unfortunately, that's just an economic change that has happened. The other group who can benefit from these positions are graduate students. Sometimes graduate students just need teaching hours. The only way you're going to learn how to teach a course is teaching one. I can give you educational theory for years until you've got a stack of 100 papers on your desk and you've got to figure out how to get them graded in a timely fashion. You won't figure that out for you without doing it. So there are places where having these courses is advantageous to the instructor. Absolutely.
But for those for whom the system is not advantageous, those who perhaps expected more stable employment within the higher education system, what could institutions themselves internally do to address this issue within the constraints that they face? Are there specific policy changes or funding adjustments that could help stabilize employment for contingent faculty?
We have a lot of top-heavy administrations in Canada right now. We have deans of everything, assistant deans of everything, provost offices that are enormous. Those people do incredibly important work, and I don't want to in any way imply that they don't, but they are also in incredibly highly compensated positions. And when things are good, when money's flowing through the system, when grants are coming in, having a large administrative force is a really good way to run a university. But when times are lean, what you'd like to see is that some of that administrative force starts to either get smaller or we start seeing some of the sessionals employed in those jobs as well as teaching, right? So that we start creating pathways for people to have stability through the rough times. That's something we need to have. We need to have a slight but meaningful redistribution of the money in the system. And that's a difficult conversation to have because once we talk about any of these positions, the position that looks like nonsense to one academic looks essential to another, right? Everyone has their jokes about the dean of equity and whatever kind of thing, but those people do really important work. We have to ask ourselves, though, if our primary mission is research and teaching, are we doing that? We need to paradoxically explain to students that they're not getting their money's worth. And that's hard.
How are they not getting their money's worth?
Because they're not being taught by people who are able to be honest. They're not being taught by people who have the time to prep their lectures. They're not being taught by people, and I think most importantly, who have the time to relax. So much of good teaching, because teaching's a different profession. It's a little bit like being a psychologist. You've got to read a room. You've got to read all the situations. And to be the kind of person who gets a PhD, you're the kind of person who maybe prefers libraries to people. I need a lot of time that's downtime. I need a lot of time to just sit and think, read a poem, and just think about what I want to say, how I want to say it. If I don't have that time, I can still show up and plug in and do the work, but it starts getting rote. I start repeating myself because that's easier, right? If you've got to do the same lecture 30, 40, 50 times, you're not talking to that group of people anymore.
I think very few students would be aware of that, and also very few parents of undergraduate students would have the sense that the person giving their child a lecture, they started lecturing at 8:30 a.m. on one side of the city. They then drove to another campus for another lecture in the middle of the day, and then they had a third 8:30 p.m. until 10 o'clock at night lecture that they gave as well on another campus, a third campus. Do you agree that that's a reality for some contingent faculty, and it's something that most people out there would never have any sense of happening?
Yeah, it's absolutely a reality, and most people wouldn't have a sense because you wouldn't think to look for it.
Yeah.
In the same way that I assume my family doctor is well paid and well compensated, so I don't really ask questions about, well, how much are you working? Well, are you maybe overworked so you have to rush me out of the office really quickly? Do you have job permanence? I just assume they do.
Yeah.
And I think we are assuming that we have a class of people who have more job security than they do. I also think that one of the ways that you make change is access to media, right? Something as simple as writing an editorial. It leads to conversations like this, but it also leads to shifting public conversations. I can do this work because I have an extra hour or two to sit down and gather my thoughts.
Was that your motivation for writing the piece? And also, was there a significance to you deciding to do it now? Do you feel that things have reached a kind of breaking point?
Oh, I think we're way past a breaking point. I wanted to do it now because I was watching the US election, and I felt like what was on the ballot was, do we believe that we have to show love and care to everybody in our culture? And I kind of felt like the US was going to say no. And I was watching a lot of people in Canada saying very self-righteous things about how we would never have a mass deportation program, how we love LGBTQ people, how we would never have these anti-trans policies, how we want the good. And I thought, yeah, and a lot of you have very comfortable tenure jobs just like me. And a lot of you aren't looking at the people right beside you whose exploited work makes your life possible. And to me, that's a crisis. When you can get to that place and it's normal, that's what I think of as a crisis.
Are there alternative employment models that you've seen either in other countries maybe or other fields, other universities? Other examples of alternative employment models that Canadian academia might consider using to addressing this crisis?
But in terms of what it would look like, if we want to try to tweak within the system, I think what it would look like is sitting down with individual sessionals and asking them, what do you want? What's your goal? I think it would look like universities saying, if we hire you 2, 3, 4 terms in a row, we've identified a need. And if we're going to hire 3, 4 years in a row for first year English, then we're creating a line. And I think it would require student government, faculty government, and, provincial government and parents of students to hold universities accountable. One thing that I've hearing some people talk about that I really like is telling students flat out how many of their hours were taught by sessionals. And just in the same way that land acknowledgements make settler colonialism visible, taking on small but meaningful tasks that make sessionalization visible without making it shameful. Because there's no shame for any of the people who are stuck in the system. They didn't do anything wrong.
No.
If anything, they're in the systems usually because they were brilliant students who did so much right throughout their whole careers. And what they really need is the time and space to do the work they're capable of doing. Or, if we don't want that, if that's not where we're going as a country, then let's have that national conversation. Let's have the conversation about, hey, we actually don't think university is that important anymore. We don't think that we need world-class universities. And maybe we have a conversation about contraction. Maybe we have a conversation that says it would be better to have 20% less universities, which would mean 20% less overall administrators, and to redistribute that money into the universities that are strong, that are have been there for a long time, your U15 schools, and making sure that those schools have as many people paid equitably as possible.
How might they change the way they advise early career scholars to reduce reliance on hope flavor? Could there be a shift in how graduate programs prepare students for a more realistic idea of the job market?
Yeah, we're already seeing that. So like when I came out onto the market, we call it coming out, which I think is hilarious in and of itself. I was told you stay on the market for 3 to 5 years. And if the market doesn't offer you something, that's kind of a way of letting you know you're never going to get anything.
Wow. That's very clear.
Very clear. And my supervisor had to tell me that. And imagine how hard that is, right? You're supervising a student. You think they have a lot of potential. And you got to say to them, the market might not see it, or it might be oversaturated. And that's okay. We're seeing programs developing alt-ac programs where we're starting to train people, maybe in digital humanities, other kind of programs like that, to do work outside the university system. We've got to create partnerships with industry so that we're, helping students see what that looks like, but also helping industry understand, okay, if I want someone with a master's, why do I want that? What are they going to do? If I want someone with a PhD, what does it look like to bring in someone with that level of research skills to help me, run a press, to help me run a magazine, that sort of thing. These things all help. I think one other thing we don't talk about enough is so many of the people who are sessionals, who are just incredible laborers and workers, there are barriers, real barriers to transitioning them to move from the university sector to, say, K-12 education if they want to teach. And sometimes K-12 schools don't want them because the nature of their training means that they would have to be paid a much higher rate than a teacher coming out with just a BA. Right. Or we're forcing them to go back and get an ed degree after they've done a PhD, which sometimes makes sense and sometimes doesn't. So we also need to look at those conversations and ask ourselves, are there things we're doing where we're creating friction for people to transition out that we can alleviate?
Yeah.
The final thing I'll say on that, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot, we need to celebrate it when people leave. We celebrate when someone gets a job. When someone gets a job, we throw a little party for them in the department. We're so happy when a grad student gets employed. I want to see a culture where a sessional's like, hey, I'm 6 years in. You guys aren't offering me a job. I'm done. And we're
because right now I'm imagining, you'll have to tell me, but I imagine there's a huge amount of sense of having failed, of it not having worked out, of giving up, very negative, very sad, right? When it doesn't need to be that way. It's a change of course that isn't even anything to do with with merit, with how good you were, with how much potential you had, right?
Exactly. And I think that's the part that a lot of us who have permanence are having trouble wrapping our heads around. We want to believe we deserve these jobs. And we don't. A lot of times it is moral luck. It's a weird collection of things happen that's stuck together. And we got in a situation where we got lucky. And if we can acknowledge the role of luck in getting these jobs, then we can acknowledge that there's a role of luck in some people not. And there's nothing to be ashamed of with bad luck. It happens.
That might help as well with the caste system idea as well, that, there's not so much of a value judgment based on not getting tenure.
Yeah, or not getting a prestigious research position or some other such thing, right?
What advice would you give to someone who's currently a sessional instructor or someone entering the academic job market with high hopes for a stable career? What advice would you give them?
Don't do it.
Don't enter the academic world.
And that kills me to give as an answer, right? When I'm working with a student and I see just a world of potential and they ask me, Dr. Paris, will you write me a letter for grad school? Now I have to say, sweet child of summer, do you know what you're asking me to do? And we have to have this conversation before they go to grad school. And I think if it's eyes wide open and if the student knows, then that's one thing, right? But sometimes I think we want grad students, we want superstars, we hold on to them, and maybe we don't tell them. But I also think there's a genius complex. And, I remember saying to a student not too long ago, honey, we're all geniuses. That's the reality of the situation. To get to this level,
won't save you.
Yeah, genius won't save you. Hard work won't save you. No, the perfect network won't save you. That's not where we are right now. We're in a place right now where a system has been hollowed out, and we either need to fill it back in and start fixing it, or we need to start telling people the truth.
Yeah.
It's not a good investment right now. If your goal is to become a professor, it's not clear what the path is. And any advice someone gives you that says, oh, well, if you do these 7 things with your resume, with your cover letter, if you just go to this school instead of that school, look, all of us are lying. We're just lying. We don't know why we got these jobs. We don't have any magic 8-ball. And many of us got these jobs 20, 30 years ago. We don't know what the market is today. Not really.
Yeah.
So then we have to ask the question, if we really care about these students, why are we signing them up to be in a system where we know they won't be cared about?
Yeah.
Or only a small fragment of them will be.
As someone who's navigated both contingent and stable academic roles, what would you say has been the most important lesson you've learned along the way?
Know your worth. Know your worth. Because when you're sitting down with a dean, I've been the person who's negotiated with sessionals, and when you're sitting down with a department head, they'll offer you something, and you'll be so flattered you're offered it that you'll just take it without thinking about the long-term repercussions. Man, if you can get in that room, where someone wants to offer you a contract, you're a star. You have achieved something remarkable as a human being. There's someone out there who wants to give you the money, the dignity, the respect you deserve. Know your worth. The other thing I think I would say, we do this job out of love. Find a place that's going to love you back. And if this job won't love you back, life is short, man. Go do something else. Go farm chickens or something. Like, I think a lot of us right now, we're so scared of a lack of stability that we'll take anything. And our labor power is going to be found in the university system by thousands and thousands of people realizing they are worth more than what they are being paid, than how they are being treated, and demanding different. So, like, at the same time, I think it sounds like what I'm saying is cynical. You know, don't come to the university. I actually think it comes from a deep place of saying, I think we're all deserving of love and dignity and respect, but you have to love yourself before a system can love you. And you're not going to find love through the approval of the university. You've got to approve of yourself first. And if you think you're valuable, you don't need this job. You can choose to take it. But I talk to too many people who need it. And if you need it, that's when hope labor happens.
That is extremely powerful. Thank you so much, Jamie. I think we'll end there. That was a really awesome discussion. Thank you. I think we covered a lot of ground, and it's clear that you have a huge amount of knowledge, experience, and passion about this matter. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to The Academic Issue, a podcast by University Affairs. Jamie's article for University Affairs, The Exploitation Trap of Hope Labour, is linked in the show notes. You'll also find links there to further reading on sessional academic work. Stay on top of higher education news, opinion, and career advice by visiting universityaffairs.ca and sign up for our newsletter to receive weekly summaries of the big stories in Canadian academia. And don't forget to subscribe to The Academic Issue and leave us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can also follow us on Instagram and X. Links can be found in the show notes. The Academic Issue is produced by Kate Kenyon with audio production by FEL Creative. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on The Academic Issue.